Though it's not a new word, most of us never heard the term dysfunctional until a few years ago. In the last decade, however, dysfunctional has become one of the buzzwords of this mixed up generation in which we live. The dictionary actually defines the noun dysfunction as the disordered or impaired functioning of a bodily system or organ. In layman's terms, that means your body doesn't work the way it's supposed to work. But that's not exactly how the word is used today. Most often, we hear dysfunctional, and it's applied to human relationships. We hear of dysfunctional families, dysfunctional marriages, dysfunctional sports teams, dysfunctional governments. And in these cases, dysfunctional describes intimate human relationships that don't work the way they're supposed to work. Now, it may surprise you to know that although the word is new, the concept of dysfunction has been around since the beginning of time. Just look at the pages of Scripture. Consider the very first family, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve blamed each other for their own disobedience. And then their kids. Cain murdered his brother Abel. And consider Noah and his 3 sons. For instance, Ham, it says, uncovered his father's nakedness. Consider Abraham and Sarah. He lied about his wife. He called her his sister. And his nephew Lot was a major disappointment. What are some of the symptoms of dysfunctional relationships or families? Well, we see a lot of it in our story we're considering this morning. Estrangement, family members who avoid other family members. Anger, and it may be expressed or repressed. Lack of trust, seen in faulty patterns of communication. Deception, the inability to speak the truth to other family members. And unhealthy secrecy, refusing to face the truth. Of course, you may find one or more of these traits actually in a healthy family or relationship from time to time, but dysfunctional families live as if this is the pattern of life all the time. I also want to note this fact. There's no such thing as a perfect family. Not one. Never has been, never will be, as long as sin is a part of the human condition. Sin, you see, distorts everything that we do, everything that we say. It colors life so that no marriage, no family, no parent-child relationship is truly perfect. And I'll tell you, when we look at Jacob's family today, it is far from perfect. This morning's events begin with Isaac, believing that he's about to die, doesn't know when. His fondest dream is to ensure that before he dies, that his son Esau obtains the cherished blessing. Of course, God, remember, a couple weeks ago, already told Isaac that Jacob was to receive the blessing, but Isaac doesn't listen to God. That's sin, and that is one cause of dysfunction in a family. Now old and frail, Isaac's sight is failing him, calling for Esau. He sends him out to hunt some wild game. And Isaac says, prepare me the kind of tasty food I like. Bring it to me to eat so that I may give you my blessing before I die. Now, Isaac's intentions here are clear. Isaac still wants Esau to have the rights of the firstborn after he's dead. By sending him out to hunt for game, what Isaac is actually doing is asking Esau to do what a firstborn son should do. Take Isaac's place as the head of the family and be the provider for the family. And once Esau has prepared the meal, now Isaac will then be free to give him the blessing. Now, what's wrong with that? Ordinarily, in this culture, nothing would be wrong with that. But here, in this case, God has already spoken, declaring before the boys were even born that the older will serve the younger. That meant that Jacob should be treated as the firstborn. And during the years of the twins' lives, Isaac had evidently never been willing to accept God's choice of Jacob over Esau. He played favorites, and he kept his plans a secret. Now at last his plans to give Esau the blessing in deliberate defiance of God's will. And in doing so, Isaac is making 4 mistakes. He is clearly trying to overturn what God has said. He is ruled completely by his own feelings and senses. He ignores the fact that Esau is spiritually unqualified for the blessing, and he conspires in secret with Esau to hide his plan from Rebekah and Jacob. And that has dysfunction written all over it. Now, none of this matters to Isaac. He wants his favorite son to have the blessing, and if he has to connive to make it happen, that's exactly what he's going to do. If he has to deceive his wife and his other son, then so be it. But the plan didn't work because Rebekah was secretly listening to Isaac and Esau. More deception, more secrecy. She then repeats to Jacob what she overheard, and then she cooks up a scheme of her own. Still more deception and more secrecy. And her plan is simple. Jacob is to go out and just simply kill 2 choice goats out in the backyard, and Rebekah will cook up a tasty meal for Isaac. Jacob will serve it to his father while pretending to be his brother, and then thus tricking Isaac into giving him the blessing. And at first, Jacob protests. But a curse will come upon me if I'm caught. I mean, Jacob knows right from the get-go that this is the wrong thing to do. But Rebekah replies, in the words of mothers throughout history, just do what I say. Now, clearly, Rebekah is the dominant leader in the family. And I would summarize her personality with 4 words: strong, resourceful, decisive, and cunning. Rebekah is the prime mover in the story. Who thought of the deception? Rebekah. Who said, go get the food? Rebekah. Who said, put on the goat skin? Rebekah. Who said, let the blame fall on me? Rebekah. Who said, leave home till Esau cools off? Rebekah. And at every point, Rebekah is in charge. She always has an answer for every question, and she has the solution for every problem. Now, I have a question at this point, and maybe you do too. Maybe you have more than one question. If this dirty deed was so brazenly wrong, why did Jacob do it? I think Jacob said to himself what many of us, if not all of us, say to ourselves when we want something to go our way. Well, God wants me to have the blessing, so if I have to cheat just a little bit to get it, that's all right. God will understand. How many times have we reasoned in that way? Jacob, you see, is half right. Just like we are half right when we reason in a similar way. God did want him to have the blessing, but he was also half wrong. God did understand what he was doing, and it wasn't what God wanted him to do. What happens next is so well, or known so well, that it hardly needs repeating. Jacob, wearing the goat skins that had been prepared by his mother, carries the tasty food to his dad, Isaac, and although he is old, he senses that something is wrong. His mind tells him that Esau couldn't have gotten the wild game so fast, and that doesn't sound like Esau at all. Now, note the many ways that Jacob deceives his father. He lies, and then he lies again, and then he lies again, and then he lies again. I mean, notice all the deception. First, there's the deliberate deception. I'm Esau, your firstborn. Then there's blasphemy. Oh, the Lord gave me success in my hunting. Then there's repeated deception. Are you really my son Esau? I am. Dishonest intimacy. So he went to him and kissed him. And then misleading details. Isaac caught the smell of his clothes. So many lies. I mean, they seem to build on each other. This should not surprise us. This is what happens when any of us set off on the path of deception in any area of our lives. And this follows whenever you say, it doesn't matter how we do it. Jacob's lies are bound to happen because he decided that the end justifies the means. And soon one lie leads to another, and then another, and finally you have to keep track of all the lies, and you can't keep them all straight. And in any case, Isaac sets his doubts aside. And he gives Jacob, thinking he's Esau, the blessing. Jacob now receives from Isaac the blessing revealed in the Abrahamic covenant. Now, one other note. In this scenario, I ask you, who is deceiving whom? On one hand, Jacob is definitely deceiving his father, Isaac. I mean, that's obvious. However, Isaac, because he thinks Jacob is really Esau, thinks he's deceiving Jacob by giving the blessing to Esau. So both intend to deceive the other. The only difference is Jacob succeeds. And yet the most amazing point is that in spite of all the human deception that takes place here, God's will was done. Why? Because God's choice, Jacob, did in fact end up with the blessing. Now, that doesn't justify the deception in any way, but it does demonstrate how God works through the weakness of sinful people to accomplish his purposes anyway. And this story, seen in that light, then, is a story of the sovereignty of God. It reminds me of the words that Joseph utters later in Genesis 50:20. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. The dysfunction in this family had gotten so out of hand and gone so far that it eventually pitted brother against brother and husband against wife, and wound up with Jacob stealing both the birthright of the firstborn and the blessing that accompanied it, and then fleeing for his life afterwards. Obviously, rivalry, animosity, miscommunication over the years have been a major factor. So what can we learn from this biblical family whose relationships pretty much define the term dysfunctional? Or better yet, how can our relationships function properly? Well, first and foremost, what we learn is that in our relationships, we need to communicate clearly and honestly. A wife went to see a lawyer about getting a divorce. And he asked, do you have grounds? And she says, yeah, well, we have about 2 acres. And he shook his head and said, no, I mean, does he have a grudge? And she said, no, but we have a carport. And by this time, the lawyer was getting really frustrated and asked, does your husband beat you up? She says, no, I get up before him every morning. And totally exasperated, the lawyer finally asked, okay, why do you want a divorce? And she said, well, we just can't seem to communicate. Communication is essential to relationships, whether in families or amongst people. Communication is essential to life. It enables us to get our ideas across to one another. Unfortunately, when we're sharing ideas, communication can become a roadblock, a stumbling block, and sometimes make us feel like a blockhead. We must remember these points. Communication requires that we listen, and that means that we focus. It's 2 ways. You can do a lot of talking, but about 80% of what you do in communication ought to be listening, focusing in on what the other person's saying. Communication should be uplifting and positive. All the communication I hear today is tearing somebody else down. It should never tear anybody else down. It should always build somebody else up. And communication should always be other-centered. One of the hallmarks of a strong family or a strong family relationship is that the people in the family are other-centered. We must believe in helping each other out. Obviously, everybody in Isaac's family seemed to only be interested in themselves or their favored son. Jacob and Esau almost remind you of the old Smothers Brothers hit, Mom always liked you best. We all know that in life there is going to be conflict. There is going to be trouble. Isaac and Rebekah kind of remind me of the family I read about whose son, who was a college sophomore at the time, had been at school that second year. You know how the second year goes. You're always getting into trouble in one way or another. And so the son received a postcard from his parents who were vacationing in Greece. And the postcard read, "Dear son, we are now standing here on a high cliff from which the ancient Spartan women once hurled their defective children to the rocks below. Wish you were here. Love mom and dad." Okay, I'm glad you're laughing. That's a joke. Good. A functional family is a place, not where we hurl people to the rocks below. No, we're supposed to find reassurance and support. We know instinctively that as human beings, our physical, emotional, and spiritual needs are fulfilled through relationships. Now, does that mean there won't be conflicts or mistakes? No, but strong families realize that there's probably a good explanation or at least reasons for the particular behavior that they're considering at that time. And as a consequence, they don't get all their exercise from jumping to conclusions or jumping to blaming and criticizing others. And when mistakes in judgment or action are made, mature Christians seek to facilitate change through love, through reason, through examples, rather than anger, deception, and control. Honest communication is how we build trust. And strong relationships, you see, ought to offer a safe place where opinions can be expressed and discussed as a part of the maturing process. And when there is trust, you see, there can be humor and there can be joy. Oftentimes in dysfunctional families, there's humor, but it's at the expense of someone else in the family, or it's denigrating. When there's no trust, then you get the actions of Jacob and Rebekah, conniving to get their way. And when there is no trust, then there's a lot of room for intimacy. Pretty soon it all becomes about power and control. Within a strong, functional family or relationship where trust is prevalent, it's simply about the power of love, God's love, and how that love influences and shapes lives. The power of God's love, as experienced through Jesus Christ, is the most powerful force of change there is. It is in our relationship with Jesus Christ that we discover trust and intimacy, love and mercy and grace and forgiveness. And this in turn allows us to build trusting, intimate relationships with others. But here's the key. From a Christian perspective, we're called to have a Christian value system. And that value system should reveal itself in all of our relationships. That is, God must have first place in our lives. Like John tells us, we love because God first loved us. Our relationship with Christ must be the number one relationship we're called to develop and maintain first and above all others. Then, clear and honest communication and concern for other persons and trust will flow appropriately from us if Christ is truly first in our lives. When Christ is first in our lives, we learn through our relationships how to live out our relationships with others. We learn firsthand what it means to love and be loved, what it means to live without secrets, without deception, without selfishness, without walls, without animosity. We learn what it means to live with a spirit of love and grace that isn't dependent upon the other person's response. The mature Christian stands strong in belief and commitment to God and is so confident in the power of God's love, they can be loving to others all the time. Robert Schuller tells about a little girl who was hearing impaired. And as a consequence, she could never hear her father's most important message to her, which was, "Dear Sarah, I love you." Her father traveled a great deal as a part of his job, and he had the habit of calling home just around dinner time. And as he talked with his wife, he always asked how Sarah was doing, their 6-year-old deaf daughter. And just a minute, his wife said one night, "I'm going to put her on the phone." And the next voice the man heard that night was the wonderfully familiar voice of Sarah, his 6-year-old deaf daughter, saying, "Hi, Daddy." "Hi, Sarah, I love you." But Sarah couldn't hear. And instead, she started chattering nonstop, as only a 6-year-old can do. "Wait till I tell you what we did in school today," she began, "and we had so much fun first, da, 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 da." And whenever she paused for a breath, her father would say, "Sarah, I love you." But Sarah couldn't hear and would continue her excited recap of the day. "Sarah, I love you." No response. And finally, little Sarah simply ran out of steam. "Well, gotta run, Daddy," she said. "See you later." Click. She was gone. She never heard her father's simple, very important message, "Sarah, I love you." Now, I wonder how Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Esau would have reacted if one of them, just one of them, simply would have said, "I love you." Oftentimes we get so busy telling each other our side of the story, our position, our wants, our needs, we become deaf to the message our family is trying to convey. A message that should all simply say, "I love you." I got a challenge for you this week. I put it in my newsletter a couple newsletters ago. I think that if we have a Christian value system where Jesus Christ is first and foremost in our lives, there is never a need on our part to get angry, upset, tear people down using cutting words. No, we need to be positive. We need to be uplifting, Don't focus on the negative. Tell people how we can accomplish something in a positive way. I encourage you in the days ahead, during Lent, to be as positive, as forgiving, as merciful, and as loving as you possibly can be. I love you. Amen.